The world has always feared China's machine. They fear the artificial intelligence networks. They fear the massive fleets. But the reality is the exact opposite. 21.3%, that was the record youth unemployment rate before Beijing rushed to hide the data. So how does an empire armed to the teeth end up collapsing in the face of people doing absolutely nothing? Chen, 24 years old, is a software engineer who has locked himself inside an apartment in Chengdu. Every month, he lives on 3,000 yuan from his mother's pension. His only work is washing dishes and mopping the floor. He does not go outside, he does not shop, and he refuses to date. He is not alone. Chen is what China calls a full-time son, one face of the millions of young people now choosing to lie flat. They are deliberately withdrawing from the economy altogether. This is Beijing's worst nightmare. The state can use security forces to crush a protest in the streets, but no power on earth can force a hopeless person to go outside and spend money. The silence of Chen's generation is locking away trillions of dollars in domestic consumption. That rupture is now directly threatening global technology supply chains. Do not mistake this for ordinary laziness. Let me show you why this system is pressuring young people to give up. Let's start with the core of the problem. This is how the social contract in China actually worked. For 3 decades, the state offered the public an unspoken deal. You agree to work like crazy. In return, you get to buy a home and become wealthy. Real estate was never just lifeless blocks of concrete. It was the only trusted tool for building wealth. It was the mandatory condition for young people to get married. It was the only ladder an ordinary person could use to climb into the middle class. But that ladder has been snapped at the base. Reports from Bloomberg and the Wall Street Journal point to the brutal truth. The biggest giants of all, like Evergrande and Country Garden, have officially defaulted. Massive developments have turned into ghost cities, covered in green moss. Trillions of dollars have simply vanished. No warning, no miracle rescue. And when that bubble burst, it burned away an entire generation's hope. Look at the mechanics of this game. Housing prices are still completely out of reach for the young. At the same time, upward mobility and future income opportunities have been cut off. Elite engineers like Chen have realized they are trapped in an equation with no solution. Personal effort no longer produces any reward. It does not matter if they work themselves to the bone 6 days a week. It does not matter how impressive their degrees may be. They remain permanently locked at the bottom of society. Financial exhaustion has stripped them of the right to dream. A lot of people will say this is just an ordinary economic downturn, that the property market will eventually recover. But this is not a short-term market correction. The entire debt-driven growth model has run out of energy. The collapse of these giant property projects is only the surface. The paper losses are just the first warning signs. But that is still not the worst part of the story. Because this structural despair is now driving an unprecedented form of economic resistance. Let me show you how that despair turns into a weapon. China's young people are not marching in the streets or smashing windows. They've chosen something far more ruthless and far harder to fight. They call it lying flat, or in its more nihilistic form, let it rot. This is not some impulsive social media trend. This is a full-scale boycott of the economy. Official data once showed youth unemployment above 20%. But people like Chen are not simply unable to find work, they are actively refusing to step into the machine. They understand that working 12 hours a day will only make their bosses richer. They do not borrow money to buy homes, they do not buy cars, they reject marriage and childbirth. They slash every form of consumption down to the absolute minimum needed to survive. This is the largest passive strike in modern history. It is a deadly silence that is choking off every engine of growth. Last week, Chen officially deleted every job app from his phone. Then he walked to the end of the alley and used his last spare cash to buy a lottery ticket. He is not alone. Data from China's Ministry of Finance shows that lottery sales have just shattered all historical records. When a system strips away the reward for hard work, people would rather gamble their future on a spinning machine full of numbered balls. Many Western experts look at this and shrug. They say Chinese youth are just lazy, no different from Gen Z in America with trends like quiet quitting. But this is not because this generation is weaker or softer than the one before it. It is because this despair is structural and almost impossible to break. In the West, quiet quitting usually means doing the bare minimum to protect your mental health. You still collect a paycheck, you still go to the grocery store, you still buy things, and you are still protected by some basic social safety net. In China, lying flat is a total rejection of the system's entire promise. There is no safety net waiting underneath them. Once the only ladder upward has broken, every extra effort leads only to deeper exploitation. They have realized that the only way to avoid losing this game is to stop playing. And this mass rejection is not confined to cramped rental rooms or rundown internet cafes, but that is still not the worst part of the story. Because once tens of millions of young people all lock up their wallets at the same time, the entire financial bloodstream of the nation begins to freeze. Let me explain how one generation's dead end can drag down an entire economy. When young people stop spending, money stops moving through the market. Data from the Financial Times confirms a chilling reality. China's vast economy has slid deeper into deflation. An economy runs on the speed of money. One person's spending is someone else's income. When young people like Chen refuse to buy homes, construction giants default. When they stop buying technology products, factories are forced to lay people off. Then the workers who lose those jobs cut their own spending even harder. The financial bloodstream that keeps the entire national body alive is slowly freezing solid. Some people will say an authoritarian state can easily force consumption, but this is not because the central government lacks stimulus packages. It is because no authority on earth can force people to sign up for 30 years of debt. And this is not the first time the world has seen something like this. In the 1990s, Japan went through a similar phenomenon. They were called the Satori generation, young people who gave up on the race for advancement. When the property bubble burst, Japan's youth pulled back from spending altogether. That withdrawal helped drive the Japanese economy into 3 lost decades. The same mechanism, the same brutal logic. This is not a prediction. It is a pattern that already froze a major power for 30 years. But the consequences in China could be far more destructive. This deflationary spiral is now directly damaging the state's own circulatory system. For years, local governments depended on a single formula. They seized land and sold development rights to property companies. The profits from land sales kept the bureaucracy running and funded infrastructure projects. Now, with no buyers for homes, that financial chain has broken. Land has turned into dead assets that cannot be converted into cash. The revenue that once fed millions of state employees has suddenly evaporated. According to Nikkei Asia, the treasuries of many cities are being drained at high speed. They are staring at enormous debts they have no realistic way to repay. This is the trap created by the cost of control. The system drained society to create the illusion of growth, and in the process, it created a generation that now refuses to produce. The result is that it is cutting off the regime's own core financial oxygen, and that is why the collapse will begin with unpaid bills. At this point, the downturn is no longer just a problem on macroeconomic reports. Once the treasury runs dry, the survival of political power itself begins to come into question. The breakdown must eventually spread into the security apparatus, because a nationwide surveillance system cannot function without electricity. The bankruptcy of local governments does not exist in some isolated bubble. It connects directly to the integrity of the national security network. All of these phenomena are symptoms of one model: burning through the future in order to preserve power. The real solution would require Beijing to redistribute wealth back to ordinary people. It would need to shrink the state apparatus aggressively and stop pouring money into phantom projects. Not for reasons of democracy or human rights, but because basic accounting logic leaves no other choice. A giant high-tech control machine can survive only as long as a giant cash flow survives with it. China's Skynet camera network cannot run on political faith. It runs on millions of cloud computing servers. It needs tens of thousands of maintenance engineers and vast amounts of electricity every single day. Those physical operating costs are hard numbers that cannot be postponed forever. Once budgets start running dry, local police departments cannot keep paying staff. In some places, authorities have already begun turning off streetlights and surveillance cameras to save money. And once there is no money to pay the bills, this supposedly perfect surveillance network will inevitably develop countless blind spots. If this youth rejection of work continues for several more years, tax revenue will dry up and local pension funds will begin to collapse. That is not some distant fantasy. It is a very plausible scenario right in front of us. At that point, the tiny pension Chen's parents depend on could be cut or frozen altogether. The last life raft keeping him afloat in that small room would be torn away. He would have nowhere left to hide from reality. But things could turn in a far more brutal direction if Beijing panics and decides to turn on the money printer to rescue the security budget. Hyperinflation could wipe out the buying power of what little savings people still have. The most dangerous variable, and the one almost nobody talks about, is the limit of hunger. Once food becomes too expensive, the young people who are lying still will be forced to stand up. They will go into the streets not to look for work, but to fight to survive. And the consequences of this rupture will not stop at China's borders. What Chen is going through in Chengdu will be felt all the way in America's industrial states. Once the domestic market fully breaks down, Beijing will become desperate to export the crisis. To pull in cash at any price, it will dump massive volumes of goods onto foreign markets. From electronics components to steel to solar panels, the ports of the West could be flooded with underpriced Chinese goods. That desperate wave of dumping would crush domestic manufacturers in America. American workers could face the risk of mass job losses. Instead of competing with a confident rising superpower, the world may have to brace for the violent spasms of a sinking system. Chen is still sitting quietly in that cramped room. The only difference is that the camera at the intersection outside has already gone dark. This is not just the collapse of an economy. It is a core lesson about the true nature of power. In the end, technological control is always an enormous economic burden. The fall of a surveillance empire will not begin with riots. It will begin quietly, the moment no one is left to pay the electric bill. Is the world ready for what happens when this power runs out of momentum? Or will we simply stand there and watch the machine slowly lose power? Everything depends on how long the people refusing to play this game can endure.